Good morning, everyone. Yeah, everyone's logging in. Welcome. It's good to see your faces this morning. Even though we continue to be socially distant, it's good to have ways of togetherness, and I'm super happy that you guys have joined us this morning for what is, I believe, the seventh episode, if you can use the word episode, in our ongoing Christian formation class, Race, Whiteness in the Church. And today we have a speaker which needs no introduction, and that is our own Pastor Jason. So really happy to have him speak to us, especially about a subject that is so close to his heart and important to him. So thanks for being here. And this will be the normal format of Jason's going to share a presentation and lecture, and we'll have some time at the end for a few discussion questions. And without further ado, I'll hand the mic to you, Jason.
Thank you, Drew. Yeah, Drew, thank you for having me and inviting me to be a part. And good morning, everyone. I have quite a bit of material, so I'm going to hopefully, prayerfully, get through the material, and we'll have time at 8:50 at the latest for questions or comments. Both my wife and I are former school teachers in Seattle Public Schools and have taught in a number of different contexts in and out of the classroom. And so trying to bring some of that to bear with some theology and history. So with that, let's go to the presentation. All right. All right, so the title of this is Education, Race, and Belonging. Oops, why aren't you letting me move it? That's weird. Hold on. Oh, there we go. All right, so these are the goals that are for our class: understanding more history of race and experience of being Black in America, discussing the topic of institutional racism. And these are the ones we are reminded of every session. So I won't read everything, and for the sake of time, I can't read everything. Our key verse this morning is Isaiah 58, 6-7. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him and not to hide from your own flesh. So keep those verses in mind, particularly what I have emphasized at the bottom, not hiding from one's own flesh. Keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. Why do you keep doing that? Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So I want to submit to you two crises of imagination when it comes to education in our society. One is a deflated imagination among students of color. About a year and a half ago, every Tuesday, I'd be at Garfield High School tutoring, and I was part of the Urban Scholars Program. And that program I had worked with in 2011 because Garfield, like many high schools in the public school system, Garfield has two tracks: the honors AP IB track and the general ed track. And most of the students of color are in the general ed. And so the Urban Scholars was focused on getting those kids from general ed to honors and AP and beyond. And so I would tutor young youth of color from middle school going into ninth grade. And I remember sitting with a young woman. I've told this story recently in a sermon, very bright young lady. And she sat there one time. We were going through the Joy Luck Club, and she was having a hard time understanding it and getting through it. At least that's what she thought of herself. I was watching her, and she was a fantastic student. And she says, I just don't belong here. And what I have sensed over my years teaching is, unfortunately, a deflated imagination among students of color that they don't belong in places of education, and certainly higher education. The second crisis is the inflated imagination within dominant culture. Whereas the one was don't belong here. The overinflated imagination within dominant culture in our country is I am the gatekeeper or benefactor. From James Anderson's book, of education. He says most Northern missionaries, after Reconstruction, slaves are set free. Uh, Blacks are starting to lobby for public education. It says most Northern missionaries went south with the preconceived idea that the slave regime was so brutal and dehumanizing that Blacks were little more than uncivilized victims who needed to be taught with the values and rules of civil society. Many missionaries were astonished and later chagrined, however, to discover that many ex-slaves had established their own educational collectives and associations. So what's going on here is that in the South, African Americans began setting up their own Sabbath schools where churches wouldn't have Sunday school. They would actually start elementary school in their churches. They would lobby for the government to pay for public education. And so Northern missionaries who were abolitionists during the antebellum period would come down imagining that these people were so beat down that they needed their help desperately. And while they did need help, these people had their own agency and desire for education. These two crises are what I see at work in our society when it comes to education. What is the problem here? I think a problem is our failure to cultivate a proper goal or telos within our educational structures. What really, when we ask ourselves, what is the goal of public education or Christian education, seminary, graduate school? Some might say it's to get mobility. Some might say it's to be a civil participant in society, to be socialized. But my argument for today is addressing institutional racism, is to destabilize rampant inequality, sorry, not inequity, anxiety and chronic institutional racism within multiple strata of education. We must cultivate a context of belonging. Too often our telos, like I said, is geared towards mobility, certification, civility, or even altruism. But brothers and sisters, what if our goal of education is cultivating a mutual sense of connection, communion with fellow sojourners, rather than competitors after a specific goal? If our youth and staff educators are not keeping in view that we belong to one another, then outside forces of self-sufficiency, love of mammon or money, and racism will continue to fester and foster inequality. And I'm going to unfold that. So I realize I'm saying a lot, but I'm going to keep repeating the same things in different ways. So I borrow a good deal of some of this presentation on the work of Willie James Jennings, two books. One is After Whiteness and Education and Belonging, where he's reflecting on Christian education and seminary education. And I also have his book, The Christian Imagination. Hang with me here. Some of those concepts are a little highfalutin, but I think they really are helpful. In his latest publication, Jennings talks about how we must work in the fragments. We're not doing education properly and serving people well in public education, Christian education, if we're not dealing with these three fragments: the fragment of faith, culture or colonialism, and commodity. The faith fragment, he writes, it's the creaturely pieces of memories and ideas and practices that we work to attune our senses to the presence of God. So in education, if we're not dealing with people as spiritual beings, even in public education, dealing with spirituality and our creatureliness, we're not doing it correctly. And he says that the creaturely pieces and ideas that we have in our faith are sometimes in our tradition in the PCA are the means of grace, preaching of God's word, prayer, reading the Bible. These are means of grace. But he says everything is in slices and slivers. We don't have a whole picture of ancient Israel. We don't know what Jesus did when he was a teenager. We don't know what the prophets, all of their desires, angers, and frustrations are. So we apprehend Christianity by faith, not by science, by faith. The point I'm pressing, he says, toward here is not that all knowledge is fragmentary, partial, and incomplete, and that we must therefore function with a chastened agnosticism, but we must be reminded we are creatures and we live in pieces, and God works in these fragments, moving in the spaces to form communion with us. So the faith fragment should cultivate faith in God and humility before him, his word, and his people. It should make us charitable in our posture towards others of different theological or spiritual persuasions. for Christian education to honestly deal with the fragments is reminding us that we are creatures and we should treat one another as fellow sojourners, that our spirituality is not just facilitated by our reason. Or if I was speaking to a Pentecostal congregation, I'd say our spirituality is not grounded in our enthusiasm and whipping ourselves into a frenzy. It applies both ways. In public education, working in the fragments means to honestly deal with the fragments and acknowledge a theistic perspective, and that spirituality is not a byproduct of mythology. Jesus dealt in the fragments, right? Here's God, he knows everything. He's omniscient, yet he's human, and he submits himself. The Bible says he learned obedience as a son. And here in Luke, he says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. And on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Surely he knows that he is God. He's taught he was God. Yet he remembered to not walk in self-sufficiency, but walked in humility. The second fragment, the colonial fragment. There are colonial fragments that have shattered worlds, which are constantly trying to unfold and piece together. And he says, loss of memory, where worlds were shattered into pieces. This is talking about when European powers, missionaries, governments moved into the quote unquote new world, and these worlds were shattered, or when chattel slavery was fostered between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Whole languages were lost, lands were taken, practices and rituals were lost. Everything that we have here in our history is in slices and slivers. And so many people of color know this fragment. I, as I've gotten older, have really wanted to recover some of the things that were lost in my own personal history and wed them with my Christianity, rather than seeing Christianity solely from a Eurocentric or white person's perspective. Jennings says this fragment work is a deeply Christian calling. Everyone, regardless of their background, should be called to this. Born of the tragic history of Christians who came not to learn anything from indigenous peoples, but only to instruct them and to exercise and eradicate anything and everything that seemed strange and therefore anti-Christian. And I will explain more of that later. Too many peoples made Christian under these destructive forces continue the destruction by perpetuating fear and disgust for their own people's practices. I wrote an article in a national PCA magazine about a decade ago as a church planter, and talking about how coming out of seminary, I'm implicitly and almost unconsciously become so Eurofied that I would show up to preach in African-American churches and automatically think, well, they don't have their theology together like me as a Reformed person. That's what that last quote is about, is that for people of color brought up in a system that is predominantly Eurocentric, we can unintentionally disdain our own people and the strength of our own background and culture. The colonial fragment, whereas a failure to engage the faith fragment engenders self-sufficiency via reason, failure to deal in the colonial fragment it betrays an ahistorical posture and grossly overlooks all cultures affected by colonialism and imperialism. And we're reaping the benefits of that. We're reaping the whirlwind of that in light of 2020 with so much upheaval. For white Christians to ignore this fragment is hurtful and fosters just disdain for the church. As students of color, to engage this fragment with, as you get older, they have the opportunity to join these cultural fragments, recovering them, dealing in them, coming to cope with the pain of the past, and wedding them with our Christianity. Yahweh declared that exiles would work in fragments of the past in order to forge ahead. Keep in mind that he tells them that your identity after exile is to recover. Always remind yourself where you came from and let that inform you as exiles in the new covenant. Jeremiah 16, therefore, behold, the days are coming that it shall be no more said, the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But let's work in the fragments of the exile. The Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands where he had driven them. He wants them to always refer back to the exile, and that the Lord had saved them and brought them from a mighty long way, and to recover what was in the past and let that inform the present and the future. And we don't do that in our educational structures. We like to function as if we just showed up and keep it pushing. The third fragment, admittedly, is the hardest to apprehend, but I hopefully rendered this so that it's clear. It's the commodity fragment. This is the fragment of reduction, commodifying and reducing the lived world into its utility. Whereas indigenous cultures in Africa, the Americas, and even to this day, if you go to Sacred Road Ministries and you talk with the history of the Yakima Reservation, they see the land, they are part of the land, they identify with the land, they belong to the land and the land belongs to them. The European settlers and mindset and modern day gentrifiers, right? They see the land in terms of its utility. How can I make money? You live in Seattle, you see how much this mindset reigns. Things are torn down and the land is used for profit. To know a thing is to possess a thing. The Western mentality is to learn a thing not chiefly for its enjoyment or intrinsic value, but for its usefulness in the marketplace. How many times as educators, whether you're a homeschooling parent or an educator in the classroom, do we have to buck against the teaching to the test? Have to buck against learning something just for the sake of getting an A? This fragment subtly forces us to be franchised by our traditions. I'm a Presbyterian, ride or die. I'm Reformed, ride or die. Anyone else is not the true church. Or I'm the neutral, sophisticated voter in the Northwest. I'm neither right nor left, and I can critique both sides, and I'm the most enlightened. Or I'm a Seahawk fan, ride or die, playoffs or no playoffs. It makes it hard to see oneself in a shared project of life with others, rendering others through a constrained intellectual vision that turns everyone into possessors of a tradition. The commodity fragment offers a failure to engage and it serves the god of commodity and exchange in our culture. For students of any cultural background, working against or being an awareness of this fragment means resisting the commodification of our journey for profit or notoriety, avoiding the reduction of our scholastic relationships toward a quid pro quo. I want my students to understand and enjoy learning for the sake of learning, not in order to pass a test, in order to get an A. But that's what we see when we talk to our students in RUF or we go and talk to college students, how much anxiety is pressed upon them. I was going to quote this book. It's not dealing with race, but it's by Madeline Levine called The Price of Privilege. And she's talking about how upwardly mobile students in our culture have so much pressure on them that they have become increasingly depressed. If you have teenagers, you know this dynamic. And it's because of the commodity fragment. For teachers and staff of other institutions, including churches, it is finding the balance between, yes, we've got to pay the bills, we've got to reach benchmarks, but not so tightly that it fractures growth. Also, we must be aware, as the book of Revelation warns us, of not being complicit with Babylon, the system of economy and godlessness, love of money, and exploitation. And we must resist the powers in the heavenly places that lie behind human governments. Ephesians and Colossians speak to this. Yahweh and Jesus resisted the commodity fragment. Similar to Yahweh's criticism of Israel's words, why have you fasted and you have not seen? Jesus refuses also to reduce relationships down to quid pro quo. To what can I compare this generation, Jesus says? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not mourn. What I'm trying to communicate, what are you saying, Pastor? Is that what I'm communicating is that our Western education institutions center themselves on what Jennings calls the white self-sufficient man. I said self-sufficient man because you can find this in other cultures as well. The SSM is the embodiment of Western education's goal. It's an individual who, counter to the gospel, reduces faith to a science, ignorant of the ravages of colonialism and Eurocentrism, and who masters knowledge for the sake of exchange. The idols here are self-sufficiency, willful ignorance, and the love of mammon. Our schools are not places of drawing near to one another, and I think you all know this, but of anxious competition and striving. This dynamic has devastating results on people who, according to Western United States educational standards, are on the bottom, typically African American, Latino, indigenous folks. Where does all this come from? It comes back to 500 years ago. The 16th century missionary guy that really is really underrated and very influential in our Christianity, but also in the world of education, is Jose de Acosta. He's a Spanish missionary who served in Peru and Mexico in the late 16th century. If you study how he does theology, how he does missions work, you'll see and uncover a lot of things that our churches and our institutions are captive to. He says, first, although the gross darkness of unbelief has obscured the minds of these nations, he's talking about the indigenous peoples, it cannot be found, the notion of God, cannot be found in the language of the Cusco, nor in the Mexican tongue. So he comes to the New World, says, oh, look at this. God has brought us here. We are God's people, and these people here are godless. There's no trace of God in them. They don't even have a word for God. Like many after him, Acosta did not have, according to Jennings, a Gentile remembrance. I love that term. The idea that actually we are not the hosts, as we talk about in our Serving the City meetings and ministry. We are not the hosts, we are the guests. We are fellow Gentiles brought in and grafted into the people of God. Instead, what happened in the Middle Ages into the Enlightenment is that the church in the European continent began to replace themselves as Gentiles and saw themselves as the chosen people. That is a subtle and devastating, fatal nuance in our theology, that we didn't see ourselves as fellow Gentiles along with the indigenous people that we saw. We didn't see them in the light of common grace as image bearers. Failure to maintain a sense of humanity and common grace, seminaries that Acosta established and many after him have founded became places of racial hierarchy. By seeing indigenous people as incapable as to be God's people, everyone else was captive to the demonic in their eyes. Jennings writes, in Acosta, the hermeneutics of idolatry was modulating something new, an ethnographic, anthropological vision of cultures arranged hierarchically. What is he saying here? They would go into these places, set up schools, set up labor groups, and those who were of lighter skin, they were viewed to be more intelligent. Those of darker skin, least intelligent. And this became the practice across the globe in Catholic and Protestant seminaries. When they would go to Asia, the lighter skinned people of Chinese and Japanese descent were seen to be more equipped to become Christians and to be Christian leaders. And they developed what Jennings calls a racial scale, with Asian on top, light-skinned Asian on top, and all the way at the bottom would be indigenous people, and then furthest at the very bottom would be people of African descent. The European gaze became the gatekeeper and arbiter of who was saved and who could lead. This has this trend of distancing white from everyone else and white from certainly Black became amplified in slavery and even persisted in the Reconstruction era, where the people of God, particularly white people, began to retreat. While Blacks in the South made haste to set up their own Sabbath schools and were even willing to be taxed, in James Anderson's book that I quoted earlier, these people were coming out of slavery, didn't have a dime. And the white people in the South said, we do not want you to tax us for education. And so the Blacks said, no, tax us, even though we don't have any money, tax us so that we can have public education and learn to read and write. Southern whites actively sought to intimidate the KKK, the White League. They would eventually retake public office and take back the promises of the Reconstruction era. Whites only lobbied for public education when they realized that they needed to, as the quote says below, be properly prepared to maintain the supremacy of the white race. Tad DeLay, a book I have and have read, he kind of has the axe to grind. It's not always the most well-written book, but he has some great points. He doesn't like white evangelicals very much, but again, there's some wisdom in what he's saying. He writes in his chapter Against Knowledge, DeLay points out that white supremacy and dangerous stereotypes of Blacks led to Christian withdrawal and the birth of the homeschooling movement in America, as well as private schools. People would leave the public schools because they didn't want to be with Black people or people of color, and they would set up the Christian movements of homeschooling and private schools. Robert Dabney, a Presbyterian forefather, very much lauded in PCA circles, was lamented, he says, he lamented the righteous taxation of oppressed people or white brethren to provide education to brats of Black paupers who are loafing around in their plantations. That's what Dabney says. Public schools were depicted as godless places of socialization that were unsafe and uncouth for upwardly mobile whites. This trend moves from Reconstruction era into the previous century that you and I just came out of. The retreat of whites continues. I'm going to play a excerpt from a podcast called Nice White Parents that underscores this trend after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So let me go ahead and play that really quickly here. All right. You should be able to hear this coming here.
Nice White Parents is made by Serial Productions and brought to you by the New York Times.
I want to take you back to a time when a group of idealistic people, feeling hopeful about the future, about America, threw themselves into the fight for racial integration. It was 1963, and New York City was planning to build a new school right next to a housing project where the students would be almost entirely Black and Puerto Rican. But these white parents came in and said, no, don't build it there. Put it closer to the white neighborhood. That way all our kids can go to school together. They were dogged, these white parents, lobbying the city at meetings, writing letters, saying, don't build it there. It will inevitably be a segregated school. And we want our kids to mix with Black and Puerto Rican kids from the projects. It's a decade after Brown v. Board of Education, they said. Schools should be integrated. There's an archive filled with letters where the parents wrote things like, we don't want our white children to be part of some, quote, small, white, middle-income clique. The Board of Education agreed, changed the entire plan, and located the building where the white parents wanted it. A few years later, the school finally opened. And then, none of them sent their kids there. I went through this box of letters, called as many parents as I could. Not a single person actually sent their kid to the school. Not one. What happened?
I remember thinking very clearly that, okay, I believe in this, but I don't sort of want to sacrifice my children to it.
No, as I said, I'm a Quaker, and so my kids went to the Quaker school.
But you were a Quaker when you wrote this letter, asking for an integrated community.
I believed in it, but...
And I think that we say a lot of things that are politically correct without even realizing that we are not telling exactly how we feel.
For years, I've been looking for an answer to the question, why don't public schools work better? What is getting in the way of giving each child an equal opportunity, an equal education? But now, I think I've been looking in the wrong places for what's broken in our schools. I think you can't understand what's broken if you don't look here at one of the most powerful forces shaping public education, white parents. From Serial Productions, it's Nice White Parents, a new...
So, and I recommend that podcast. She breaks it down, and you know what? One of the trends that has happened in recent years, and we see this in Seattle, is that parents are attracted to come to schools like Garfield or MLK or Thurgood Marshall, and they are come because because in order to integrate, the government and local municipalities incentivize public education. They say, well, come to these schools to help integrate them because we have these great programs. What are they doing? They are using a third commodity fragment to recruit people to come to these schools. And all that ends up doing is fostering two schools in one, where you have the kids in general ed, and then you have the AP and IB kids in one that are being supported, whereas a lot of youth of color are not in these programs. What is killer and breaks my heart in that podcast, she goes to the 1960s, but then she goes to just a few years ago, talking about the same issues happening in New York that happened 60 years ago. the same things that anger me as a former educator in public schools that I saw in 1998, I see in 2021. And it's so frustrating. We keep recapitulating the same things over and over and over again. Let me get back to the slide and share my screen with you. And we're actually moving along pretty good here. So 1 second. All right. Okay. Play from current slide. Okay. So while inner city schools are left with meager resources, they're also damned for not performing well. This is the way we treat people coming out of prison. We put them on parole, which I'm not saying you shouldn't have guardrails or anything, but you just kind of damn them into further recidivism. We do the same thing with our schools. The No Child Left Behind Act rewarded achieving schools and withdrew support from schools that were quote unquote struggling. This forced teachers like me to be tempted to teach to the test. I remember becoming an educator and teaching at Nathan Hale, then I taught at Cleveland High School. And we were told, you gotta make sure we help this school, Cleveland, because if we don't become an achieving school, we're gonna lose funding and continue to just put pressure on us. So we'd have to work through tests. And I remember sitting on committees, working through standardized tests, combing through them, trying to contextualize them for people who weren't white. There's more to it than that. Don't have time to go into that. People really don't like No Child Left Behind. It was changed and replaced. Obama signed Every Student Succeeds Act, which was less problematic, but still keeps the same structures of an inequality in place. The school to prison pipeline is another development from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where youth of color have been seen as predators or super predators. You may have heard in recent campaign, the campaign season we were coming from. Roar white males, sorry about that, for white males, the period of time when, boy, that's terrible, when boys are not held fully for their actions can extend well into their late 20s. So boys can be boys, right? But in contrast, Black children may be viewed as adults, as threats, as soon as the age of 13. Overt discrimination has been outlawed, but it has not been totally eradicated. It's just been repurposed. And so in the 90s, you saw a lot of our language and a lot of our educational structures reshaped in order to criminalize Black and brown youth. Many policymakers and educators would see them as emotionally disturbed. You would see disproportionately youth of color in detention. What we see in Seattle, what we see across the country are Black girls, people of color, LGBTQ youth of color find themselves repeatedly suspended and expelled and put in the streets, referred to law enforcement. The trends start early. Black children represent 80% of national preschool enrollment, but they make up 42% of preschool suspensions. What do you look like suspending kids who are in preschool? How dumb do you look? Sorry. And it's so weird to talk to you guys. I'm just talking to a screen right now. But I remember being the first Black teacher at my high school in 14 years. And by the end of the school year, our principal said, Jason, you're the only teacher to not suspend or send your kids to detention, because I refused to. And unfortunately, I would come in, both my wife and I, we would come out of in and out of our internships in the College of Education at UW. And many of our white peers would talk about how they had a hard time working with these ghetto kids here in Seattle local schools. There's a problem there. We also see chronic segregation currently in our time of pandemic. So I'm going to exit on my screen here and play for you a little short interview I did with a friend of mine who works on the pandemic outreach team for Seattle Public Schools. Let me stop the share here. Oh, wait, no, I'm not supposed to stop the share. Oh, hold on. Let me, okay. How am I gonna do this? Oh gosh. Okay. Can you see this? Can you see?
Yep, it's working.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Devin, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your work in the city and with the district. Can you share some of the maybe historical and just current day inequities you see in Seattle Public Schools?
Yeah, my name's Devin, and I'm a former student of Seattle Public Schools, and I still do work with Seattle schools. One important thing that happened to me in the past, during Seattle, there was a busing period when we were going through a period where people were trying to force integration of our school system. And I would travel from Yesler as a third grader and get bused all the way to Northgate. My sister and I were split between Viewlands Elementary and Northgate Elementary. My main school was Bailey Gatzert Elementary, which is right along an intersection between Yesler and Rainier. And then after that, they stopped. And I think I got the tail end of busing in Seattle. And what's interesting is no action was ever taken to remediate the segregation that was happening in Seattle. So those issues still affect us where North schools or largely white schools have better facilities. And even to this day, when you look at schools in South Seattle or Central Seattle, they are still the most limited schools. A big school today that's still persistent with inequity, Rainier Beach High School still has not any PTA or PTSA that is helping fund them. And then you contrast that with a school like Roosevelt, and they have booster clubs for multiple programs. And that's just an aspect of affluence, of zip code, and larger issues for program change are happening today. The pandemic is keeping us stuck because of our past. Big issue in the news is there was a civil rights probe charged against this school district because of special education limits. According to the report, only 40 kids in Seattle are getting special needs when other areas are able to serve over 700 students with special needs. The big issue behind that is I know that majority of schools that have good environmental equipment for airflow at schools, which is required because of health conditions of the pandemic, the best schools are in the north. And that's a form of structural racism. Better equipment and facilities exist. Because of that, it's contributing to the shortfall of special needs. And again, this is not because anyone was excluding kids on purpose, but just the way that our buildings are made contributes to racism. And so one of the things that I told the school system in the summer was, we can't force all these kids to go north. It was an inconvenience when we bused kids in the past, and we're going to do it again. But kids should be able to go to school where they need to go to school where they live. And limitations of getting safe, healthy measures of education locally are stunted because of that structural racism and because of the past that we never resolved. So that is, that's a legacy that's still happening in Seattle. And we never came up with an alternative solution to divide or undo the divide of North versus South in Seattle.
Wow, thank you. So, obviously, yeah, this is in the news as recently as January 14th, so just a few days ago. So what is our response as a church? And I'm so happy because we are going to have time to talk. Are we going to continue to hide from our own flesh? I'm purposely trying to get up in your Cheerios this morning. Okay, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm not trying to get you all up in your feels unnecessarily. But we do need to be agitated. What are we doing with our children in public education? What are we doing with our kids if we choose to not put them in public education? How can we still be a blessing to other youth? How can we equip our young people we're raising in our homeschool or private school or Christian schools to foster belonging, to heal our land? And too often the church, this rebuke is towards the church, that we say that we love God and we are about true Sabbath, and yet we hide from our own flesh. Maybe some of us need to put our kids into public school. Maybe some of our kids need to be withdrawn from public school. My point is that you should be interacting with these three fragments for the sake of not just your children, but for the sake of our commonwealth. A deep embedded sin in our culture and our church is turning away from our own flesh for the sake of safe schools or getting ahead, right? And these preferences are rooted in racism from 500 years ago. The idols of self-sufficiency, ignorance of our past and ignoring it, and the pain of others, and love of money. So how do we build towards belonging, towards communion? These are some questions not perfect. I can't get all the questions right, but here's just some things to chew on. Are we teaching ourselves and our children their creatureliness before God and people? Are we teaching them to be self-sufficient or members of a collective? How are we being true to our personal histories of struggle that are and that of our neighbors with our youth? Again, that's the colonial cultural fragment. What educational and institutional choices are being made for the sake of mobility and security? In what ways are you complicit with Babylon when it comes to education? What about on the meso level, neighborhood? How can we be a presence in our local schools? Let's say your kids aren't in local schools, public schools. That doesn't mean you can't lobby for the diversification of our curriculums. That doesn't mean you can't advocate that we lobby for more diverse teaching staff. It doesn't mean that you can't write letters to your elected officials on these things. It doesn't mean that you can't get involved in extracurricular activities at your local schools. What do we say beyond the school setting in our online forums that sometimes on these online web forums, they're fostering fear and threat of youth of color that walk our streets. I've seen it. How about in the city, state, and country that's supposed to be macro? What can we do at City Hall? What can we do in Olympia? What can we do in DC to change laws, to leverage them, to protest, to build greater unity in our world? So some practical initiatives on the horizon. It's easy for us to imagine ourselves, especially in the church, as benefactors to people of color or to those who are vulnerable. And yes, people need mercy. People need initiatives to help them. But I think it's also imperative that we move towards groups and initiatives that focus on empowerment and agency amongst Black and Brown youth. I can't stand the narrative that we are just these Black folks and we don't love education. If you just look at the history in our country, we love and have fought for education. So here are some institutions you might be familiar with: Community Passageways, they do, and Youth at 180 help young people who are on the streets, giving them tools to not just change their path from the streets, but also become leaders themselves. Community Passageways makes it a point to put young people of color in leadership within their organization. The Umoja Peace Center, part of Africatown, I used to volunteer there. Their whole thing is working in that colonial fragment, rebuilding the cultural fragment. Black Star Line is similar. They do a lot of good work. And right now we're hoping to partner with them on some food distribution programs in South Seattle and King County. New initiative in partnership with Africatown, Decriminalize Seattle Community Passageways is the Community Restorative Pathways Project. Maybe, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think Carissa Taylor might talk about that in a couple of weeks. But that's a collaboration, again, of helping out of the defunding of some of the police. And I know that can spark a whole another type of topic. But through that, the city did peel off some money to help establish the Community Restorative Pathways Project, which I'm very excited about. I think can do a lot of good work to in the justice system. And again, working for empowerment's sake. And then also I'm really excited about, we were establishing a partnership with Lowell Elementary and Union Church in South Lake Union, where we're giving money and hopefully time and treasure with volunteering, setting up a hotspot with 15 kids at the 415 Westlake Center. And that's going to be a great opportunity for us to do educational justice. We just had a meeting with the gentleman who's coordinating from Lowell and members from Seattle First Baptist and Union Church. And the guy from the Seattle Public Schools was in tears, just saying how much he was so thankful that the church is stepping in to partner in this way. So these are just ways that as a church, we're trying to get engaged, but we have much work to do. That's my presentation. So I'm wondering if we could have some comments or questions, and I think Drew's gonna facilitate that.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I loved your presentation, and I think it's really great to have someone who has such expertise and has spent time in the education system and thought deeply on these issues share with us. And it uncovers for me, you know, how even for, you know, white folks who are well-meaning, we can just be insulated so much from the problem sometimes that we don't see them. So it's always good to put ourselves in the circumstances where we become aware of these challenges and build our awareness. Yeah, we have 12 minutes for questions, and I would love to hear from all you guys. What are your thoughts? What things were unclear? How are you responding to what Pastor Jason brought to us today?
Could you relist the fragments at the beginning? I came in like 5 minutes late and I've missed the first one. Do you
Sure.
think you could just like recap really quick?
Yes, the first fragment is the faith fragment, or if your child is in public education, I tried to say more spirituality, but Jennings calls it the faith fragment. It's just recognizing our creatureliness before God and recognizing that within our faith, we don't have everything. We don't have the full list of everything Jesus did. We don't know everything that Jeremiah felt and thought. And so we apprehend our faith in humility, knowing that these things, what does it say in Deuteronomy? Moses says, some things are beyond us. I'm terrible at this, but to the things that God has revealed to us, we respond. I'll have to find that verse. But anyway, the point is that we don't have every single thing. And sometimes because of the Enlightenment, we sharpen the sword of our faith and treat it as a science rather than an actual art. There's a spiritual artisticness to our spirituality.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts or questions? I know Pastor Jason dropped a lot of content on us today, so it's fine if there was something that, you know, that we moved through quickly or that wasn't clear. You know, now's a great time to ask him questions or share things from your own experience.
I see Lisa and I see Nathan. Lisa?
I just wanted to say what was really clear, and I'm going to be thinking more about, is the context of belonging. And just thinking about learning together in the context of school, but then also another quote I wrote down from you is in the church, when we kind of think we're the best church and the other churches don't get that, I just really want to change how I'm thinking about belonging and community, because I did grow up in a very more individualized context. So I am just really thinking that I want to be more belonging to others and giving my gifts, teaching that to my kids, and how that affects both church and school. So thanks for sharing that.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for sharing. I think Nathan had his hand up.
Yeah, Pastor Jason, thanks for sharing. I think you bring a unique perspective because of your background in education, as well as your seminary training. So I'm grateful for that. I'm wondering if you can flesh out that belonging idea as kind of like the meta goal of education. Like, what would that look like in terms of, a first grade classroom where we're trying to get the kids to learn how to read as kind of like a learning objective. Could you just maybe flesh that out, or if you can think of a better example because your kids are in middle school or something, that's okay too.
Yeah. I'm thinking in terms of just the structures of how we do things. I think but I'm not an elementary school age teacher, but I think even for first grade, working with those three elements, those three fragments, and helping kids understand that they're not in this alone. I think part of the reason, I think all of our kids, regardless of their cultural background, are really affected by the quote unquote commodity fragment, where we realize that we need to perform a certain way in order to get approval. And I think that can be very isolating. And so I think even for elementary school age, all in through high school, is fostering a sense of togetherness, fostering a way that maybe we restructure our lessons, our lesson planning, how we put together units that are more project-based, more person-oriented, that are less about reaching a certain amount of data. I think in terms of how we do middle and high school, there's a number of ways that we isolate, particularly youth of color, by not acknowledging the pains and dynamics in the past. They put you in grad school through ed psych courses, understanding the psychology of education in grad school. And some of it is learning the schema or the background of your students. It means that as an educator, I have to be a student, not just of my own background and not just the material that I'm offering, but the schema or the lived world and experience of students in the classroom. And I think once I become a learner myself as an educator, I can tap into a lot of the pain, a lot of the narrative of people in the classroom. And when you know my story, when you share my story, not in a way to exploit, that creates a better sense of belonging and togetherness. I wish I could answer that more effectively, but I think there are also some structural ways that educators and administrators in schools can better structure belonging. And like I said, the Urban Scholars Program was another program like that, that was intentionally trying to blend the general ed and honors track for the sake of educational justice. I think Charles had his hand up, but I can't see everyone. I'm sorry, Drew. Drew? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Charles, go ahead.
Well, I have many questions, but I'll start with this one because obviously we have been focusing primarily on Blacks, but we find the same problems with Hispanics, Pacific Islanders, and how can we address those better? Second thing is we're in a new legislation time for the state. And are there things we can do to encourage more funds for building better facilities for low income areas?
Yeah, both on those things are yes in the affirmative. I mean, my brother here, Devin, from Seattle Public Schools, will tell you how he was bused up from Yesler and Bailey Gatzert up to North Seattle. And he just yesterday when we were talking, he said, I couldn't believe that they gave us water. We didn't even have running water at our school in the Central District. So yes, Native American, Latino, African American are at, unfortunately, the bottom statistically in terms of performance, Southeast Asian as well. And some of the things that we try and do is have ELL and instructional assistants in the classroom who are equipped in that way, but it's still difficult trying to figure that thing out. On your second point, I know we're coming up on the end of the class. we need to be lobbying. I think for everyone in this call, we need you to be politically active. There's no reason to not be offering your voice at the Seattle school board meetings, at the city council meetings, writing the governor or your elected representative or senator, asking for changes to be made in the public schools. And I think there are opportunities there that we can certainly be about mercy. And, we have a partnership with Bailey Gatzert. We're helping out with Lowell, but we have to change laws. We have to get money resourced better.
Yeah, and I think on that front, I mean, it's probably a big uphill battle considering how ingrained the way of funding public schools is in the United States. But the fact that it's based on, local taxes creates a racist outcome and an outcome of inequity where certain zip codes have, like the gentleman that you interviewed, Jason, better equipment, better functioning air circulation and all of that stuff by virtue of where they are. And that works against a sense of belonging. And I can speak to, my own choices. Sarah and I, we had baby Asher, he was 6 months old, and we were looking for a house, and we were looking at 2 houses, one in Columbia City and one in North Seattle. And the determining factor was the rating of the school systems. There's those ratings, you look and you see the numbers, and we just had kids and we wanted our kids to go to the better school. And we moved north. And at that time, I didn't think that there was anything that had anything to do with racism. But really it does. And it's not that, I was being racist necessarily or Sarah, but it's that understanding of institutional racism, that there are incentivizations in place and some people who have access and some people who don't. And just something for us all to think about. Do we have one last question? Anyone else have a question about today's content?
I have a question on homeschooling. But I know there's other families who homeschool more, so if they have a question on it, that might be more pertinent. Just your perspective, because I have many of my friends grew up homeschooling, and the narrative that some seemed a little presented here, and maybe it's just one perspective, but was that we take our kids out of public school because we're scared of public school, we're scared of the people in public school. And I recognize that is a motivation of some. It didn't seem like necessarily a narrative. Some of my friends, my peers now who are homeschooling, probably more like, but they do have the resources to homeschool and the time. And so I recognize there is certainly a segregated reason, like ability to homeschool. But what are your perspectives on homeschooling in light of like wanting not to segregate further?
Yeah, no, I think homeschooling is not in and of itself intrinsically bad. I think what I'm trying to communicate historically is that a lot of the homeschooling movement stemmed out of racism, that people were trying to flee public education. They saw them as godless places where particularly African-American or other students of color who were dangerous or disruptive would be. And that's just the history of some of the original intent of those movements. I'm not against homeschooling. I partially homeschool my kids. I partially homeschool my kids because I know what the public schools do to Black kids. However, I don't think whether you homeschool or not, or you have your kids in Christian or private school, you need to be thinking about how can you still bless your local schools? How can you, even in terms of extracurricular activities, not withdraw people who have the light from the world? We're supposed to be present in the world. So my wife and I mean, we're in Seattle Public Schools. They still are in heterogeneous classes with kids of different theologies and spiritualities and lifestyles. And their teachers are all over the place. But so we have them at home, but we also have them in the schools partially. And it's for that very reason, in order for them to grow, but also for us to be a light. So Hey, if you're mad at me, come at me, bro. If you teach homeschool, we talk to me after class. But I'm just saying, I think that even if you're homeschooling your kids, think about ways to presently make them be a part of systems that need to be undone and prayed against. Ephesians chapter 6. Our battle is against powers and principalities that work against to foster evil. Elder Drew just talked about this in the previous presentation about spiritual powers behind human governments and forces. And I'm going long. You're starting to make me preach. I got to save my strength. I don't even know if I answered your question. Homeschooling is not bad.
Yeah, no, I understand
Okay.
the overarching message.
Right.
Yeah, well, it's the top of the hour, and I think on behalf of all of us, I just want to say thank you, Jason, for your for the deep reflection that you have put into this, your preparation and bringing this to us today. And thank all of you for showing up today and participating. We are going to continue to have these classes into the new year. I have some really exciting speakers lined up. And next week we have Pastor Leslie McCrory, who's a very close personal friend, again from Muncie, Indiana, an urban light church there. And she will be offering a presentation called Being White, about the idea of whiteness. So please join us 2 weeks from now for that. Good to see you guys. And I look forward to worshiping with you in about a half an hour.
Thanks, Drew.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks for coming. We had someone request to put the slides on the website. I can see if that will be possible.
Yeah, and I had asked for them too.
Oh, okay.
To Drew, but yeah, because I think there were some like references you had and things to just, even if you make a PDF of it or something, that might be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye.